Welcome to this latest episode of Canonically Speaking. My guest today is Philip Milligan, who's head of the legal office at the Dicastery for Laity, Family and Life, which is the department of the Roman Curia that exercises the Holy See's competency for the lay apostolate and associations of the faithful. Philip comes from Scotland, where he studied law before going on to study philosophy and languages in Belgium, and then canon law at the Santa Croce Pontifical University. So welcome, Philip, and perhaps first of all you could fill out that itinerary, what it was that led you to be in your present position and role.
Thank you, Paul. So I'm a member of the Emmanuel community, which is an association of the faithful of different states of life, which I discovered when I was a law student on pilgrimage in Paris in southern France in the late 1980s. And through the Emmanuel community, I studied philosophy in Belgium and worked for the church in this place of pilgrimage in Paris Monial. And with some young pilgrims with whom I was working, regularly went to Rome to work to help them discover the church, in fact, which became also for me an opportunity myself to discover the Roman Curia, to meet people, led to me being invited to apply for a job in Rome at the Pontifical John Paul II Institute for the Family. So I arrived in Rome in 1997 and worked in the International Relations Office of the John Paul II Institute for about 8 years. And after that, I worked in Rome for the Emmanuel community, and among the different things that I did, I worked with a team who were trying to assess the internal training and formation needs of the members, especially the lay members of the Emmanuel community. And so one of the things that we would do would be identify the types of profile of academic qualifications and personal experience which would allow us to say this type of profile fits with someone who we could ask to study Holy Scripture, or this person we could invite them to study moral theology. And there's also, from that point of view, a profile of people we thought we could ask to take on some studies in canon law for the internal needs of the Emmanuel community. And so developing this profile, it was pointed out to me by my colleagues that this profile kind of fitted me as well, someone who had done a little bit of theology, a little bit of philosophy, who had a juridical background, a legal background in terms of civil law, and also was in a place where it was possible to study canon law with a certain facility. There are 5 canon law faculties in Rome, so it wasn't particularly difficult to imagine that it might be possible to further these studies. So without any particular idea that I would work full-time on questions of canon law, I started to study towards a licentiate in canon law. During that time was approached by the Dicastery, the now Dicastery for Laity, Family and Life. At that point it was the Pontifical Council for the laity, to work on different questions of canon law, which led me eventually to working inside the Dicastery. So I've been there since 2011.
And you're working now then with international associations of the faithful, ecclesial movements, new communities. What is it that links these, and what is it that separates them?
So the work that the Dicastery does in its canonical vigilance over the international associations of the faithful in general, that comes already from the desire of the Second Vatican Council to have an office inside the Holy See that would promote the apostolate of the laity. And that meant, of course, also promoting the shared apostolate of the laity, the associative apostolate, if you want, that we find already expressed in Apostolicum Actuositatem. So that means that at the same time we include in this very broad canonical category of associations of the faithful, associations which have, or international associations of the faithful, some associations which have been around for a very long time. That might include, for example, the Legion of Mary, or they include in various forms. Also the Marian congregations that were promoted under the Company of Jesus already in the 1800s, but also includes the different expressions of Catholic action, as well as the type of professional international federations that started to develop in the wake of the First World War and then after the Second World War to promote peace, to promote a Catholic perspective on world affairs. So that would go from all of the different Catholic organizations which are linked to UNESCO to things like the International Federation of Catholic Doctors, for example.
What sort of numbers are we talking about here, international associations of the faithful?
So all in all, we're talking about something like 120 associations of this type. So about 40, very roughly perhaps 40 or 50 of them fit into this category of things which either come from Catholic action or which come from these different international federations linked to the growth of the international institutions from the League of Nations onwards through the United Nations, these things. Probably, I said 40, 50, so that would make perhaps another 20 or 30 which are expressions for lay people of religious charisms, for example. You quite often have religious orders who have a lay expression which is entirely autonomous. It's not a third order under the direct control of a religious congregation, but it shares in a common charism. For example, if we look at the Salvatorians, have a male branch. They have which began with St. Francis Jordan, I think in the 1800s. They have a female branch which began later in the 19th century, and then more recently, again after the Second Vatican Council, they have a lay expression which work together in communion on these things. Another something of this type might be also something like the Schoenstatt movement, which has one single founder, which has a whole series of shared works, which while having canonically separate institutions. So we could say that we have these three types of categories: things which come from a lay response to the social questions of the life of the church, things which are an expression of traditional spirituality, often linked to a pre-existing religious charism, and then things which come perhaps which are more related to the work of a new spirituality, and which would include things like St. Vincent de Paul or the Legion of Mary or the movement of Schoenstatt, and things which we'd more specifically would call new ecclesial movements or new communities, beginning probably around about the time of the Second Vatican Council. Some of them already have some form before that, most of them afterwards, which clearly indicate a founder or several founders expressing a new charism, not so much linked to a particular activity, but which proposes a real way of life, something which englobes the whole of the person's baptismal life, the whole of the desire to seek holiness, live a life of charity, and often to want to evangelize. So we have these three different categories among the international associations which are watched over by the Dicastery.
And what is it the Dicastery does then to support the life and development of these associations and movements?
There is a canonical aspect, which is quite simply already the canonical recognition given to them as international associations. That means they're recognized through the Dicastery by the Holy See. That means also approving their statutes. So if it's public associations, that means we're going to erect a public association and approve its statutes. If it's a private association, we're going to recognize this as an international association and approve its statutes. Thereafter, it's working with the associations to accompany their government. Many of these realities grow over time, some of them in quite exponential ways, which means that we have to, or we try to help them develop new ways of helping the government grow to fit with the growth in numbers, with the expansion across different countries and different continents. At the same time, work with these different lay movements on their projects for Christian formation. Most of these realities have a very strong aspect of spiritual formation, theological formation, fitting their members in order to be able to bring the gospel to the daily lives of people round about them in professional life and social life. And so they are laboratories of training and formation, in fact, laboratories for baptism and holiness. And so we would work with these movements in helping them develop the training information, but also in helping share the things that they teach their members with other realities, perhaps even with bishops' conferences and with other instances within the church who could benefit from their experience. There's also an aspect of helping to better define and protect their founding charism, the specific states of life that there might be within these different associations. So all within an idea to helping these different realities develop their own identity so that they continue to grow in a way which really brings energy and vigor to the church and its mission.
You mentioned earlier the change of name from the Pontifical Council for the laity to its present name of Dicastery for the laity, family and life. What would you say is the significance of that? And does it change substantially the work that you're doing?
The Pontifical Council of the Laity, as I said, came out of the decree on the apostolate of the laity, on the request from the Council Fathers for there to be a place within the Roman Curia which promoted the lay apostolates. As that grew over the end of the 1960s and through the 1970s, it had different names, but quite early on became the Pontifical Council, not of the laity, but for the laity, which meant different states of life could work in the service of the laity. The secretariat is made up of priests, religious, married people, single people, all different states of life. Then within the work of the Pontifical Council for the laity, there was an office for marriage and family. And under John Paul II, at the same time as he set up in 1981 the John Paul II Institute for Studies on Marriage and Family, John Paul II took this office for marriage and family, which had been an important part of the Council for the Laity, and made it a Pontifical Council on its own. That functioned as the Pontifical Council for the family from 1981, 1982 until 2016. And then under the newest reform of the Roman Curia under Pope Francis in 2016, these different aspects, the lay apostolate and marriage and family, were brought back together again in this new dicastery for laity, family and life. So at the same time, this consolidated the work on the associations of the faithful. It allowed us to continue the work that had been done also for promoting the youth apostolate through World Youth Day. It allowed us also to integrate the experience of World Youth Day with the experience of the World Meeting of the Families. Well, a lot of sharing of experience. And I would say in terms of newness in this dicastery for laity, family and life, was that it allowed us to crystallize a real apostolate, an accompanying of the Church's apostolate on the good news of life that had been wanted by John Paul II, but became crystallized in a particularly strong way around about the questions we have today. Life as in Evangelium Vitae, we understand that life is not a problem, life is an opportunity. There is good news of life. And so a lot of I would say the new aspect this configuration has brought has been the possibility to further develop how we help the Church think through the gospel of life.
You mentioned earlier your role of vigilance. I suppose you do receive quite a number of difficult problems, things that go wrong, things that have been done wrong, and complaints and so on. And what are the procedures for dealing with that?
So obviously when associations, movements and communities grow, an association is an ensemble of people, therefore there can be different needs and which are not always met by an association. we would have, in terms of solving particular problems that come up, there are several procedures that can happen. Obviously, we could involve a lot of conciliation work between the members of an association and an international association. We've had this problem presented to us. Can we talk about this? How can this be done? Can we find a solution here? Some of these things are presented directly as petitions under the right of petition under Canon 57, which means that effectively, as the dicastery directly responsible for these international associations, we would intervene in order to resolve a petition and see if a person's rights had been respected or not respected, if they had been helped or hindered by the life of the associations. The other types of problems we're called to resolve come not from the international associations, but come effectively as recourse made by an association or by a member of an association concerning a decision made by a local bishop. Typically, if one thinks of some of the very flourishing contexts of confraternities that one finds, for example, in Portugal and Spain or in other countries, it would be not at all unusual to have some decisions concerning an association recognized in a diocese where the bishop has intervened to resolve a problem, where the person, either the person who has asked for the intervention or the association who has asked for the intervention of the bishop, not to be happy with what's happened in that point, as in all historical cases, one appeals to the Pope. And so the appeal to the Holy Father, because it concerns the lay apostolate and associations of the faithful, would be handled by the dicastery as an administrative recourse, using canons of 1732 through to 1739.
As regards the penal law of the Church, which was reformed in 2021 and expanded the penal accountability of the laity, has that affected your work?
In terms of the work we would do in terms of the penal accountability of the laity, it would still remain fairly unusual to have a penal case that would come to the dicastery concerning a lay person, because that would require it to have been, for the most part, to have been an administrative case concerning a lay person decided in a diocese, which then was appealed or recourse was made to the dicastery. Again, there are relatively few cases of that type, but potentially these things can happen. One aspect as yet untried, in as much as we haven't had any cases that have come from this, are the penal responsibilities linked to the legislation for child protection and the vulnerable. In the second iteration of that legislation, there's a direct responsibility for the moderators of international associations of the faithful, which in terms of child protection and their responsibilities there in terms of transmitting cases that come to their knowledge or handling things properly would depend directly on the dicastery. But as yet, we haven't had any particular cases. That's relatively new legislation for us.
But could you intervene if you are informed of a situation whereby perhaps the safeguarding isn't being looked after properly? Can you intervene ex officio?
So again, the dicastery, because it follows the government of these international associations, if the dicastery understood that there was a deficiency in how people's rights were being protected or people were being safeguarded within the government of an association, then clearly the dicastery could immediately on its own intervene in those cases. It could also in parallel be intervening simply in terms of how the government is fulfilling its duty of care. So there would be at the same time a penal question that might arise if there had been a particular type of delinquency, but there would in any case be a disciplinary question where the dicastery could intervene to ask the government of an association to give account for how it was caring for its members in those particular situations. More broadly speaking, the dicastery has a whole area of development where we have made and revised orientations that the international associations of the faithful are required to adopt in terms of drawing up measures of child protection and protection of the vulnerable. From 2018 onwards, we set out a series of orientations requiring the government of these different associations to put them into place, and also therefore to submit back to the Dicastery the way in which they handle cases of abuse, or the way in which they train the members of the association to work in a safe way with the vulnerable. So that's another disciplinary aspect. We have a team of several people within the Dicastery and also lots of help outside of the Dicastery who work on revising these norms and orientations that come from the different international associations in a similar way to the way in which the Dicastery for bishops would give a judgment of conformity to the norms that had been drawn up within a diocese or within a bishop's conference.
And would you like to say something about the Emmanuel community itself from a canon law point of view? I suppose it's an international association of the faithful, is it?
So from a canonical point of view, the Emmanuel community began in the early 1970s. The previous code had members of different states of life. Lay people who were married, there were lay people who were single, and there were lay people who were seeking a form of gift of self, of consecration or celibacy for the kingdom. There were also clerics and people who were thinking of a vocation to priesthood. So it was only after about 10 years of the Emmanuel community growing slowly within the church, first of all in France and then across other European countries, the new code allowed for all of these different states of life to be equally members of the same association of the faithful. From its very beginning, the Emmanuel community has had these different states of life. One of the key intuitions is that it's the interaction of these different states of life, how they share their desire for holiness and their Christian commitment with one another. They share their growth in their own vocation. That actually also helps other people's vocations to grow. One of my priest friends says, when I'm listening to sharing from a young father in the community who has to get up in the middle of the night to look after his children, it reminds me I can get up in the middle of the night to pray, for example. The Emmanuel community began as a private association of the faithful, first of all recognized in the Diocese of Paris. It was recognized as an international association of the faithful in 1992 by the then Pontifical Council for the Laity. In 2009, I think, this private association of the faithful was erected as a public association of the faithful by the Pontifical Council for the Laity. That had become something which was simply useful in terms of the community being able to carry out the different missions that were asked of it by the Church, in particular missions within Catholic education, because as your listeners will be aware, the possibility for an entity within the Church to assume tasks of Catholic education, for example, to run a Catholic school, requires them to be public juridical persons. So then in 2017, again, because there was a request for different types of missionary availability made by bishops to the Emmanuel community, the Congregation for the Clergy, now the Dicastery for the Clergy in Rome, erected as a separate juridical person, clerical association with the faculty to incardinate clerics for the members of the Emmanuel community. Within the Emmanuel community as such, all different states of life, there came into being this separate clerical association. The condition for being a member of the clerical association is that one is a clerical member of the Emmanuel community. And this, to a certain extent, was again a consequence of the requests made upon the community to make priests available for different types of missions, sometimes outside their own diocese. So currently there are something like 13 or 14,000 members of the Emmanuel community, all states of life together, and of these there would be something like 300 priests, a smaller number of deacons, permanent deacons, but about 300 priests who are also therefore members of this clerical association of the Emmanuel community. So there are bridges in terms of how the government, there's a sharing of apostolate, that's the work of the clerical association is very much embedded within the overall life of the Emmanuel community, but it's something which is a little bit new for us. It gives this possibility of incardination within the clerical association. I should point out the Dicastery for the clergy was very far-seeing in saying there should be no distinction between members who are incardinated within the clerical association and the members who are incardinated within the diocese, because obviously up until that point all of the Emmanuel community's priests had been incardinated within the diocese. And so for the moment, as far as I understand it, the situation is that there are a few priests who are incardinated within the clerical association when circumstances mean it is no longer congruous with being able to carry out their mission as a priest and a member of the Emmanuel community. They remain incardinated in a specific diocese.
Thank you, Philip. We wish you all the best, both within the Emmanuel community and within the Dicastery. Your work certainly helps us see how the Church is fostering and protecting a wide range of charisms that don't necessarily fit into traditional categories, and how the Church's legal structures engage deeply with the real life of lay associations, addressing disputes, protecting the vulnerable, restoring justice, promoting healthy governance. So thank you for all you're doing, and thank you for agreeing to appear on this podcast today. I'm sure that what you've spoken about will be of great interest to many people both within and outside the canonical world. I hope we can speak again before too long, and thank you once again, and God bless.
Thank you, Paul. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you again to my guest today, Dr. Philip Milligan. And thank you to Imma Setiadi for her rendition of C.P. Bach's Solfeggetto, which opens and closes this podcast. I'm Fr Paul Hayward, and you've been listening to Canonically Speaking. Please be sure to subscribe and follow wherever you get your podcasts for more interesting conversations from the world of canon law. And if you have any questions, comments, or even suggestions of guests for future episodes, then please do contact the show on canonicallyspeakingpodcast@gmail.com. We'd love to hear from you. So, until the next time, goodbye and God bless.